Hi, this is Scott Garibay. Today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition and what 6th edition should do, the newest edition that's coming. I think the creation is going to start in 2019 or 2020. What it should do for streamers. What should 6th edition of Dungeons & Dragons do for streamers? All right, so let's talk about it. All right. I'll give you the short answer. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's a very, very, very important that Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition design does not take streaming into account in any way from a rules perspective. As far as how the game is marketed, it's fine to think about the game from that perspective. From the rules perspective, though, it's very, very important that Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition design team forgets that streaming exists and does not give even 1 inch to streamers of acknowledging them or giving them anything within the game to make the game better for streaming. And okay, so here's why. All right, so let's talk about streaming. All right, so before I say why it should get nothing, I want to acknowledge what streaming has meant for Dungeons & Dragons, and also if Dungeons & Dragons owes streaming anything, all right? So what has streaming done for Dungeons & Dragons? It has grown the existing D&D community. That is not questionable. It is absolutely a fact. So streaming has allowed Dungeons & Dragons to grow its community significantly over the last 5 years, okay? Streaming games are responsible for a growth in the Dungeons & Dragons community, okay? Does Dungeons & Dragons owe the streaming community anything? The answer is no. They owe them nothing, right? It's the exact opposite, right? Dungeons & Dragons, the streaming communities owe Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason why is Dungeons & Dragons was a healthy game before streaming ever came along. The only thing that ever threatened the existence of Dungeons & Dragons significantly, there was things that happened in the 80s. That was cultural. It had really very little to do with the game. Well, yeah, that was cultural. It's a different topic, right? But there was a threat to the game in the 80s. But there's a very real threat to the game in the 2000s, which came from 4th edition. The rule set was disliked so much that the game actually, the existence of the game itself was threatened, okay? All right, so, but the reality is, at all times, the Dungeons & Dragons community, the Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards of the Coast and TSR, and all the companies that have owned, and Hasbro, all the companies that have owned Dungeons & Dragons, the existence of that game has absolutely never relied on streamers, right? And the reality is, Dungeons & Dragons has supplied a real solid structure for streamers to tell engaging stories and to build content easily, right? So Dungeons & Dragons as a game, Dungeons & Dragons as a community owes streamers nothing, and it's the other way around. Streamers owe Dungeons & Dragons for the incredible amount of content that they created, all right? Now, why do I say that there should be absolutely no recognition and no changes to the game to make the game more easily streamed, or to make the game more streamer friendly, right? The reason why this is very important is just acknowledging what Dungeons & Dragons is. So Dungeons & Dragons is a game. Well, there's lots of different types of games nowadays, right? Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game. It is the preeminent tabletop role-playing game. It is there are more people playing Dungeons & Dragons, all the editions together now, than every other tabletop role-playing game combined. It started the genre. It defines the genre. It is the flagship of the genre. It carries the banner for the genre, right? There are board games and there are video games, right? So here's the thing: Dungeons & Dragons is really special, much more special than video games or board games, right? And the reason why is, one, Dungeons & Dragons is an element of Americana. It's like jazz, or it's like jazz. It's like baseball. It's like comic books. Okay, where board games, that's not the case. Board games have been around a long time before America existed, right? So that we didn't create that genre, right? It's not ours, right? So it's really not a special game to Americans, right? We love board games; they're great, but they're not special like Dungeons and Dragons because we didn't invent them, right? They're not hugely impacting our culture the way Dungeons and Dragons impacts our culture. Why do I say video games are less important than Dungeons and Dragons? Well, video games clearly have a bigger impact on our culture than Dungeons and Dragons does. That can't be debated. It's just clear fact, right? But the reality is, the reason why I say, tabletop role-playing games, and particularly Dungeons and Dragons, is way more important than any video game that's ever been created is ROI. Video games are incredibly incredibly alluring. They're alluring. But they have a terrible ROI. They have a terrible return on investment in time. So, and I would say even money, right? Like, so basically, the vast majority of video games after they're played are trash. There is a collectible market, but I would say that Dungeons and Dragons collectible market is, well, you know what? That's a tough one. I don't think I'm going to go there. All right. So basically, when you play Dungeons and Dragons, you read hundreds and hundreds of pages. You learn how to control worlds. You start. Once you become a player, you're like, how do I become more socially skilled? How do I become more socially apt? Right? How do I? I've got to read these 750 pages. How do I memorize 250 pages of content? When you become a dungeon master, it just transforms your world. You're like, oh, how do I master cartography? How do I understand the political structures of a nation or a realm? How do I understand, how combat should be stitched together? How do I master interaction and exploration? It's just it blossoms your life, right? When you play Zelda, who cares? Like, you don't learn anything from that. Like, I think you do learn a couple of small, it's the same lessons you would get out of a child's book or a children's book, like be nice or something like that, right? But the reality is there's no parent in the world. Like, a parent, when they watch their child playing Dungeons and Dragons, they're like, oh my gosh, my child's been sitting on that couch reading that Dungeons and Dragons book for 3 hours. That's really interesting. And then when I see them at the table, they're talking with their friends and they're rolling dice and they're doing a lot of addition. You know what? I'm not going to tell them to take out the trash now. Let them read a little longer, right? No parent in the world gives two rat farts for their kid playing another second of video games, and that's because every parent in the world fundamentally understands that the ROI on video games is absolutely terrible, right? You absolutely do get something back, and you get you learn things, right? But the amount of time that is spent to learn those lessons is so poor compared to anything else, and certainly compared to Dungeons and Dragons, right? So the reality is, Dungeons and Dragons is literally better than every video game that's ever existed. I would say I wouldn't trade Dungeons and Dragons. You could make every video game on Earth disappear before I would tear in half a single D&D module. like it just, their value is low. They just don't stand up to Dungeons and Dragons, right? On how they shape a person's life and how they change a person, right? For the better, how they benefit a person and society and culture, right? Like, Dungeons and Dragons is just fundamentally better, right? So with all that said, right? And because of that, what really happens is Dungeons and Dragons is the game that's there for you if you never start video games. Dungeons and Dragons is the game that's there for you when you get sick of video games, right? And video games are there for you when you give up on Dungeons and Dragons and say, it's too hard to to actually mold my own social problems and be at a table with other people. Like, playing Dungeons and Dragons is aspirational. Playing video games is a retreat, right? Right. So It's exactly the same for streamers, right? For streamers are exactly the same. Streamers are without it. I fully acknowledge streamers are helping the Dungeons and Dragons community grow, which we appreciate, right? But we don't need them. We never did. Dungeons and Dragons never needed streamers to exist, right? It is always done fine without streaming. Streaming is just adding to the growth of the game already, right? But it's not fundamentally the cause of growth, right? So, with that said, right, the other one is I've been thinking a lot about what streaming really is, what streaming D&D really is, and I think I finally got an analogy that I think fully understands. So I'm a huge movie fan, and I go to the movies at the movie. When I see a movie that I care about, I go to the movies and I see it on opening night, right? Because I'm an engaged moviegoer, right? And that's what streaming is. So streaming is watching a movie 6 months after release on the small screen. That's what streaming is. It is enjoying the art and the content and the experience at the absolute minimum engagement, right? And the people who are doing it are the least engaged players and dungeon masters at macro. Acknowledged, there's some very, very engaged players and game masters at the highest levels of streaming, but it's questionable on if they're actually engaging with Dungeons & Dragons or if they're actually engaging with being content creators. I would say they're actually not really very engaged with Dungeons & Dragons at all. They're incredibly engaged as being content creators, right? And if there's a bump in the road for Dungeons & Dragons, they'll find something else to help them continue to make content. They're actually really, really involved in content creation for YouTube generally, but not that engaged with Dungeons & Dragons. So that's my point, is people who play the game in its purest form, play Dungeons & Dragons at a table, 1 dungeon master, 4 players, no camera, right? That is the absolute pinnacle premium experience of Dungeons & Dragons, without a doubt, right? It's the way Gary wrote the game. It was the way it was always intended to be played. That is the premium experience. I do appreciate that there are streamers out there who do, play streaming games, because they are helping the hobby to grow. But I always remember what they are. They are the absolute least engaged players and the least engaged dungeon masters, right? And because the reality, and again, what is their motivation? It's hard to tell if they're really interested in playing Dungeons & Dragons or if they're interested in having 1,000 people watch them in the next week, right? In micro celebrity, right? Whereas the people who are playing Dungeons & Dragons, at their kitchen table, right? 1 dungeon master, 4 players, with no camera, they love that game, man. That is about nothing but the game. There is no purer form of the game than that right there, and there never will be, right? And that 1 dungeon master, her players, sitting at that kitchen table, no camera. That is what the game should always be designed for, and it should never, ever give 1 inch of ground to streaming within the game. I'm fully okay with acknowledging them in the marketing. I'm okay with Wizards of the Coast, sending copies to streamers and to grow the game and all that. Use them for what they're useful for, but don't ever, ever, ever let a single streamer determine what actually goes into the game itself, as far as the rule book, as far as the DMG, the PHP, and the monster manual, which should be all 1 book. Don't ever let them touch that precious core content, because they just don't, they haven't earned it. That's the issue. Streamers are the absolute least engaged dungeon masters and players. And then the other issue, and even if they try to engage with the game, they really can't, or they can't know if they're actually engaging with the game. Because when you stream, you get a form of micro celebrity, and you don't really know why you're playing the game anymore. The camera impacts the game. It impacts the dungeon master. It impacts the players. They start doing things that turn it into a show rather than a game. And it's mixed, right? Whereas the purest form of the game is that dungeon master with her players at that kitchen table, no camera. And that's what they need to be thinking about when they're building Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition. Thank you.